The salute was crisp, perfect, and aimed directly at me. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen held it for exactly 3 seconds. Military protocol, while my father, General Harrison Blake, stood frozen beside him, his weathered face cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been pride if he'd allowed it. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I returned the salute with equal precision. My dress blue uniform bearing ribbons that told stories my father had never bothered to ask about. The Distinguished Service Cross caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the Pentagon conference room windows. Behind it, a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star with Valor device, and campaign ribbons from 3 different theaters of operation formed neat rows across my chest. "Major Blake," Lieutenant Colonel Chen said, extending his hand after the salute. "It's an honor to finally meet you. Your reputation precedes you." My father's mouth opened slightly, then closed. For 32 years he'd known me as Rebecca, the disappointment, the screw-up, the daughter who'd never live up to the Blake family legacy. Now I stood before him as Major Rebecca Blake, United States Army, Special Operations Command, and apparently someone worthy of respect from his own subordinate. The irony wasn't lost on me. This morning I'd been just another faceless officer attending a classified briefing on counterterrorism operations in Syria. My father hadn't known I'd be here. Hell, he probably still thought I was washing out of some dead-end assignment, living down to the expectations he'd set for me since I was 12 years old and failed to make varsity softball. "You two know each other?" General Blake asked, his voice carrying that familiar edge of authority that had intimidated me as a child. It didn't now, sir. Major Blake led the operation that extracted my unit from Raqqa last year. Chen replied, his tone carrying genuine reverence. Without her tactical planning and on-ground leadership, we'd have lost 8 men. She personally carried Sergeant Rodriguez 2 clicks under enemy fire after he took shrapnel to the femoral artery. I watched my father's face as the words sank in. The same man who'd told me I'd never amount to anything because I'd dropped out of Georgetown to enlist was learning that I'd saved the lives of soldiers under his command. The same father who'd refused to speak to me for 6 months after I chose the Army over law school was discovering that his subordinates considered me a hero. The conference room fell silent, except for the distant hum of air conditioning and the soft rustle of classified documents being shuffled at the main table. Other officers continued their pre-briefing preparations, unaware of the personal drama unfolding in the corner. My father's eyes traveled across my uniform, taking inventory of decorations he'd never seen before. Each ribbon represented missions I'd never told him about. Achievements I'd stopped trying to share after years of dismissive responses and thinly veiled disappointment. "The Silver Star, sir," Chen continued, apparently oblivious to the tension. "Major Blake received it for the Kandahar operation. Single-handedly neutralized an IED cell that had been targeting supply convoys for 3 months. Intelligence community estimates she saved over 40 coalition lives with that one mission. The Silver Star, 3rd highest military decoration for valor. I'd been awarded it 18 months ago at a ceremony my father knew nothing about, because I'd stopped inviting him to things that mattered to me. The last time I'd tried was my promotion to major. He'd sent his regrets through his aide-de-camp, citing a scheduling conflict. Later I'd seen photos of him playing golf that same afternoon at the officers' club. General Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 30 years in the military had taught him to control his expressions, but I'd inherited enough of his DNA to read the micro-expressions he couldn't quite suppress. Surprise, certainly. Maybe respect, though he'd never admit it. And underneath it all, something that looked uncomfortably like shame. "Major Blake," he said finally, using my rank for what might have been the first time in his life. "I wasn't aware you were assigned to this briefing. Special Operations Command requested my input on the northern Syria situation," I replied, keeping my voice professionally neutral. "Seems my experience with Kurdish militia integration has become relevant to the current mission parameter." What I didn't say was that I'd become the Army's go-to expert on unconventional warfare partnerships in the Middle East. that 3 different generals had personally requested me for their operation, that the Pentagon had fast-tracked my promotion specifically to put me in position for increasingly critical assignments. Lieutenant Colonel Chen glanced between us, finally sensing the undercurrent of tension. "Sir, I didn't realize Major Blake was your daughter. The resemblance is clear now that I think about it." My father nodded curtly. "Rebecca has always been independent in her choices." Independent. That was his diplomatic way of saying I'd been a constant disappointment who'd refused to follow the path he'd laid out for me. Graduate Georgetown with honors. Attend law school, preferably Harvard. Marry someone from an appropriate military family. Maybe teach at West Point or work in military law. A safe, predictable career that would reflect well on the Blake name without actually requiring the kind of personal courage that might get me killed in some godforsaken desert. Instead, I'd dropped out of college in my junior year to enlist as a private. I'd volunteered for every dangerous assignment, every deployment to hostile territory, every mission that other officers considered career suicide. I've learned Arabic and Pashto. I'd trained with special forces, earned my Ranger tab, and requested assignment to the most challenging theaters the Army could offer. "The briefing's about to begin," Chen said, checking his watch. "Major Blake, you're presenting the Kurdish integration assessment, correct?" I nodded. In about 10 minutes, I'd be standing at the front of this room, addressing a dozen senior officers including my father, explaining how to leverage local militia partnerships to maximize mission effectiveness while minimizing American casualties. I'd be speaking from 18 months of on-ground experience in a region where most of these officers had never set foot. My father would be taking notes on my recommendations. His aide would be recording my strategic assessments for inclusion in official planning documents. The United States Army would be relying on my expertise to shape policy that could affect thousands of American lives. The daughter he'd written off as a failure would be teaching him how to do his job. "Sir, with your permission," Chen said to my father, "I'd like to introduce Major Blake to Colonel Morrison. He's been asking about her work with tribal leadership structures. Thinks her methodology could be applicable to the Afghanistan drawdown planning." General Blake waved them away with a gesture that managed to be both dismissive and approving. As Chen guided me toward another group of officers, I heard my father's aide approach him. "Sir, I have those personnel files you request, including the recommendations for the Syria team leadership positions." "Later, Patterson," my father replied, his voice oddly subdued. "I need to review some other matters first." I knew what those other matters were. He'd be pulling my service record as soon as this briefing ended, reading mission reports he'd never bothered to request, learning about the daughter he thought he knew but had never actually tried to understand. The irony was that I'd followed his example more closely than he'd ever realized. He'd built his career on decisive leadership, personal courage, and an unwavering commitment to protecting American lives. I'd done exactly the same thing. The only difference was that I'd done it in ways he'd never expected, and in places he'd never imagined his daughter could succeed. As I walked across the room toward Colonel Morrison, I caught my reflection in the conference room windows. The woman looking back at me bore my father's determined jawline, and the same steady gaze that had intimidated me as a child. But she wore captain's bars earned through valor, not inherited through privilege. She carried scars from real battles, not boardroom conflicts. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't care whether my father was proud of me or not. I'd found something better than his approval. I'd found my own. The Georgetown University quad looked exactly the same as it had 8 years ago when I'd walked across it for the last time, my half-packed duffel bag slung over my shoulder and my father's voice still echoing in my ears. "You're throwing your life away, Rebecca. This family has standards." I'd been 20 years old then, standing in the dean's office with withdrawal papers in my trembling hands, knowing I was about to disappoint the one person whose approval I'd spent my entire life chasing. But something had shifted during my junior year internship at the Pentagon. While other political science majors were fetching coffee and filing papers, I'd been assigned to assist with casualty notification procedures. That's where I'd met Staff Sergeant Maria Santos. Santos had been processing the personal effects of soldiers killed in action, preparing them for shipment to families who would never see their sons and daughters alive again. She worked with a quiet dignity that impressed me more than any general or politician I'd encountered during my privileged upbringing on military bases around the world. "You know what these men and women died for?" she'd asked me one afternoon, holding up a Purple Heart that would be presented to a grieving mother in Kansas. "They died believing that someone else's life was worth more than their own." "That's not something you learn in a classroom, Miss Blake." Santos had enlisted straight out of high school in East Los Angeles, the daughter of immigrants who'd never seen the inside of a college campus. While I'd been attending embassy dinners and military galas as a general's daughter, she'd been earning her GED in night school and sending money home to support her younger sibling. Yet when she spoke about service, about the honor of wearing the uniform, her words carried a weight that my father's speeches to West Point cadets never had. She understood something about sacrifice that I'd never learned despite growing up in its shadow. That understanding had crystallized during a conversation with my father 3 days before I'd withdrawn from Georgetown. I'd tried to tell him about Santos, about what I'd learned from watching her work, about how I wanted to serve in a way that mattered. "Rebecca, you're being naive," he'd said, not looking up from the intelligence briefing he was reviewing in his home office. "Military service is about leadership, strategy, and decision-making at the highest level. You can contribute more effectively through law or policy work than by playing soldier in some infantry unit." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Playing soldier. That phrase had cut deeper than he'd probably intended. In his mind, real military service happened at desks in the Pentagon, not in foxholes in Afghanistan. Leadership meant moving pieces on a strategic board, not carrying wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. But I'd already seen real leadership during my internship. I'd watched Santos stay late to personally call the families of fallen soldiers, explaining what their loved ones had died for when official notifications felt too cold and bureaucratic. I'd seen her organize care packages for deployed units using her own money when military budgets came up short. Most importantly, I'd watched her train recruits with a combination of toughness and compassion that produced soldiers who trusted her completely. They followed her not because regulations required it, but because they knew she would never ask them to do anything she wouldn't do herself. That was the kind of leader I wanted to become. Not someone who inherited authority through family connections or academic credentials, but someone who earned respect through shared sacrifice and proven competence. The decision to enlist had been surprisingly easy once I'd stopped trying to meet my father's expectations. The conversation with him, however, had been brutal. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," he'd said when I'd told him about my plans. "Do you understand what you're giving up? Georgetown isn't just any university. The connections you're making there, the opportunities you're walking away from." "What opportunities?" I'd interrupted. "To work for some defense contractor. To practice military law from behind a desk. To spend my career in conference rooms talking about decisions that other people have to live with." His face had hardened in that way I'd learned to recognize as the end of all discussion. "You have no idea what real responsibility looks like, Rebecca. You think military service is about proving how tough you are, but leadership requires intelligence, education, and strategic thinking." The implication was clear. I possessed none of those qualities. I was too impulsive, too emotional, too willing to choose the dramatic gesture over the practical solution. In his mind, I was still the 12-year-old who'd tried to run away from Fort Bragg because I'd been angry about missing my best friend's birthday party due to another military move. What he'd never understood was that my decision to enlist wasn't rebellion. It was the first time I'd ever felt called to something bigger than myself. Basic training at Fort Benning had been everything my father had warned me it would be. Brutal, exhausting, designed to break down civilian thinking and rebuild it according to military standards. But it had also been the first place where my background as a general's daughter had meant absolutely nothing. Drill Sergeant Williams didn't care that I'd grown up on military bases, or that I could recite military history from memory. She cared whether I could carry my wounded battle buddy 2 miles in full gear. She cared whether I would choose personal comfort over unit cohesion when the pressure mounted. I'd failed spectacularly at first. 20 years of privilege hadn't prepared me for the physical demands or the psychological pressure. While other recruits bonded over shared struggles with poverty or family dysfunction, I had to earn acceptance by proving I wasn't just slumming it until something better came along. The turning point had come during a night exercise when Private Johnson, a 19-year-old from rural Alabama, had collapsed from heat exhaustion during a 12-mile march. The drill sergeants had been testing our decision-making under stress, and the obvious military answer was to call for medical evacuation and continue the mission. Instead, I'd made a choice that probably violated several training protocols. I'd given Johnson my water, redistributed his gear among the squad, and helped carry him the remaining 4 miles to the finish line. We'd been the last squad to complete the exercise, and I'd expected to be recycled for failing to meet time standards. Instead, Drill Sergeant Williams had pulled me aside afterward. "Blake, you made a choice tonight," she'd said. "You chose your people over your performance metrics. That's either going to make you a great leader or get you court-martialed. Probably both." She'd been right on both counts. Advanced individual training had introduced me to military intelligence work, where my Georgetown political science background had finally become relevant. But even there, I'd gravitated toward assignments that put me closer to operational units rather than strategic planning positions. I'd volunteered for every field exercise, every training deployment, every opportunity to work directly with soldiers who would be implementing whatever intelligence I helped gather. While other intelligence officers focused on building analytical expertise, I'd focused on understanding how intelligence work translated into life-or-death decisions for troops on the ground. That philosophy had shaped every assignment choice I'd made over the next 8 years. When offered a comfortable position at the Defense Intelligence Agency, I'd requested deployment to Iraq. When my commanding officer had recommended me for a staff position at Central Command, I'd applied for Ranger School instead. Each choice had baffled my father more than the last. He'd stopped attending my promotion ceremonies after I'd made sergeant, claiming scheduling conflicts that we both knew were deliberate. Our phone calls had become increasingly rare and increasingly strained. The last real conversation we'd had before today had been 2 years ago, when I'd called to tell him about my acceptance into Special Operations Command. I'd been excited to share the news, thinking he might finally understand that my unconventional path was leading somewhere significant. "Rebecca, you're 30 years old," he'd said, his disappointment evident even through the static of an international connection. "How much longer are you going to keep playing these games? When are you going to settle down and build a real career?" A real career. As if leading soldiers in combat wasn't real. As if risking my life to protect American interests wasn't significant. As if everything I'd accomplished over 8 years of military service was just an extended phase I'd eventually outgrow. That conversation had ended with my father suggesting I might want to consider leaving the military to pursue graduate school. He'd even offered to make some calls to help me get accepted into good programs despite my unconventional academic record. I'd hung up without saying goodbye. Standing in that Pentagon conference room today, watching Lieutenant Colonel Chen describe my work to the man who'd never bothered to learn about it himself, I'd realized something important. I'd stopped trying to prove myself to my father somewhere along the way. Instead, I'd started proving myself to the people whose opinions actually mattered, the soldiers who trusted me with their lives. The briefing had ended 47 minutes ago, but I could still feel my father's eyes on me as I gathered my classified materials and secured them in my document case. The other officers had filtered out gradually, most stopping to shake my hand or exchange contact information for follow-up discussions about Kurdish integration protocols. Colonel Morrison had been particularly interested in my assessment of tribal leadership structures. "Major Blake, your methodology for building trust with local commanders, have you documented this anywhere? We need to incorporate these principles into our Afghanistan transition planning." I'd handed him my card and promised to send him the training materials I'd developed after 18 months of trial and error in northern Syria. What I hadn't mentioned was that those materials had been rejected by 3 different Pentagon committees as too unconventional before Special Operations Command had finally implemented them. My father had remained seated at the conference table throughout these exchanges, reviewing papers that I suspected he wasn't actually reading. Patterson, his aide, had whispered updates about his afternoon schedule twice, but General Blake had waved him away both times. Now the room was empty except for the two of us, and the weight of 32 years of unfinished conversations. Rebecca. His voice carried the formal tone he used for official business, but something underneath it suggested this wasn't going to be a professional discussion. Could I have a word? I secured the final classified document and faced him. Standing at attention wasn't required. We were both off duty, but old habits and older tensions made me unconsciously straighten my posture. Of course, sir. He gestured toward the chairs at the far end of the room away from the main conference table. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the Pentagon's institutional carpeting. Outside the windows, I could see the steady flow of military personnel and civilian contractors moving between buildings, each carrying their small piece of America's global defense apparatus. We sat across from each other in silence for nearly a minute. My father had always been comfortable with tactical pauses in conversation, using them to maintain control and force the other person to reveal their position first. It was a technique that had intimidated me as a child and annoyed me as a teenager. Now, after 8 years of military service, I recognized it for what it was, a leadership tool that worked on people who needed his approval. I didn't need his approval anymore. I pulled your service record after the briefing, he said finally. Complete file, including the classified operations summaries. I nodded, but didn't respond. My service record spoke for itself. 3 combat deployments, 2 Purple Hearts decorations for valor, commendations from 4 different commanding officers, and a promotion rate that had put me years ahead of my peer group. The Kandahar operation, he continued. Intelligence reported that you conducted a solo infiltration of a confirmed hostile compound to gather tactical intelligence on IED placement patterns. That's correct. You had no backup, no extraction plan, and no authorization from your commanding officer. Also correct. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Rebecca, that wasn't tactical intelligence gathering. That was a suicide mission that happened to work out. For the first time since sitting down, I felt my professional composure crack slightly. Sir, with respect, that operation saved 43 American lives over the following 3 months. The IED cell we neutralized had been responsible for 17 casualties in the 6 weeks prior to my infiltration. And if you'd been captured? If you'd been killed? His voice carried an edge that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with a father's fear. What would that have accomplished? I leaned forward slightly. It would have accomplished the mission, sir, which was to protect American soldiers from a known threat that conventional intelligence methods hadn't been able to address. There are protocols, Rebecca. Chain of command exists for a reason. You can't— What? I interrupted, abandoning any pretense of formal military courtesy. I can't just do whatever it takes to bring our people home alive. I can't just choose mission success over personal safety. The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different. Charged. Dangerous. That's not what I meant, he said, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure what he had meant. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard where young soldiers were conducting some kind of training exercise. Their movements were precise, practiced, coordinated. Each one trusted that the others would do their jobs correctly so that everyone could go home at the end of the day. Dad, I said, using the word I'd avoided for the past hour, do you know why Lieutenant Colonel Chen respects me? Rebecca, it's not because of my education or my family connections or because I can analyze strategic intelligence reports. I turned back to face him. It's because when his unit was trapped in Raqqa with wounded soldiers and no immediate extraction available, I didn't convene a committee to discuss options. I didn't request permission from higher headquarters. I took 3 volunteers and went in to get them. I walked back to my chair but remained standing. Chen told you I carried Sergeant Rodriguez 2 clicks under enemy fire. What he didn't mention is that Rodriguez had been hit in the femoral artery and was bleeding out. Medical protocol said he had maybe 8 minutes before irreversible shock set in. The nearest landing zone for medical evacuation was 12 minutes away. My father's expression had shifted from disapproval to something that might have been concerning. So I made a choice. I continued. I could follow proper procedure, call for medevac, and watch Rodriguez die while we waited for authorization. Or I could apply a field tourniquet, put him on my back, and run like hell toward the landing zone while my team provided covering fire. Rebecca. Rodriguez has 2 daughters, Dad, 7 and 9 years old. They still have their father because I chose mission success over protocol compliance. The weight of that statement settled between us. I'd just articulated the fundamental difference between his approach to leadership and mine. He commanded from conference rooms and made decisions based on strategic assessments. I led from the front and made decisions based on the lives I could save. My father stood up slowly, his expression unreadable. For a moment I thought he might finally understand what I'd been trying to tell him for 8 years. Instead, he said, "You're going to get yourself killed." The words hit harder than I'd expected, not because they were cruel but because they revealed the real source of his disapproval. He wasn't disappointed in my career choices or my unconventional path through the military. He was terrified that his daughter was going to die in some foreign country, fighting a war he didn't think she needed to fight personally. Maybe, I admitted. But if I do, it'll be while protecting something worth dying for. Is proving me wrong worth dying for? The question caught me off guard. I'd spent so many years focused on succeeding despite his lack of support that I'd never considered whether my motivation was proving him wrong or proving myself right. "This isn't about you, Dad," I said quietly. It never was. Something shifted in his expression then. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Then what is it about? I thought about Staff Sergeant Santos and the quiet dignity with which she'd honored fallen soldiers. About Drill Sergeant Williams teaching me that leadership meant choosing people over performance metrics. About Lieutenant Colonel Chen trusting me to bring his soldiers home alive. It's about being worthy of the people who trust me, I said. It's about earning the right to wear this uniform instead of just inheriting it. My father looked at me for a long moment, and I realized that for the first time in our adult relationship, he was actually seeing me. Not the daughter who'd disappointed him by dropping out of Georgetown. Not the rebellious child who'd chosen the hard path out of spite. Just Major Rebecca Blake, United States Army, who'd spent 8 years learning how to lead soldiers in the most dangerous places on Earth. "There's something else," he said finally. "Something I didn't mention earlier." I waited. "You're being considered for promotion to Lieutenant Colonel. The promotion board meets next month and your name is on the list." I felt my breath catch. Lieutenant Colonel at 30. It was almost unheard of outside of Special Operations Command, and even there it usually required exceptional circumstances. "Sir? More than that," he continued. "You're being considered for command of the 75th Ranger Regiment's Intelligence Detachment. It's a position that would put you in charge of strategic intelligence gathering for the Army's premier Special Operations Unit, the 75th Rangers. The Army's elite infantry unit, tasked with the most challenging missions in the most hostile environments. Command of their intelligence detachment would mean responsibility for keeping America's best soldiers alive in situations where conventional intelligence methods weren't sufficient. It would also mean deploying to every active theater of operations, personally leading intelligence gathering missions that other officers would coordinate from safe distances. The position requires Senate confirmation," my father added. "Your record will be reviewed by congressional committees. Your methods will be scrutinized. Your unconventional approach to operations will be questioned." I understood what he wasn't saying. A position that high profile would expose every controversial decision I'd made, every time I'd chosen mission success over protocol compliance. It would also put me in the direct chain of command under officers who might not appreciate my hands-on leadership style. But it would also give me the authority to implement the training methods and operational protocols I'd developed over 8 years of learning what actually worked in combat zones. It would let me teach other intelligence officers how to build trust with local commanders, how to gather actionable intelligence in hostile environments, and how to make decisions that prioritized soldier safety over bureaucratic risk management. "Are you going to accept it?" my father asked. I looked out the window again at the young soldiers conducting their training exercise. They were practicing urban warfare techniques, learning how to clear buildings and protect each other in close quarters combat. If I accepted this promotion, I'd be responsible for making sure they had the intelligence they needed to do those jobs and come home alive. Yes, I said without hesitation. I'm going to accept it. For the first time in 32 years, my father smiled at something I'd decided to do with my life. The Senate Armed Services Committee hearing room felt more like a gladiatorial arena than a place of democratic deliberation. 26 senators sat in tiered rows behind an imposing curved desk, their nameplates reflecting the overhead lights like small monuments to political authority. Behind them, gallery seats were packed with military officials, defense contractors, and journalists who'd come to watch the Army's youngest lieutenant colonel candidate defend her unconventional career. Senator Patricia Hawkins of Nebraska, the committee chairwoman, had already made it clear this wouldn't be a routine confirmation hearing. 3 weeks of preliminary questioning had revealed that my promotion to lieutenant colonel and assignment to command the 75th Rangers Intelligence Detachment had generated significant controversy within the Pentagon's more traditional circles. Major Blake, Senator Hawkins began, consulting a thick folder of documents. This committee has received testimony from several senior officers expressing concern about your operational methods, specifically your tendency to deviate from established protocols when conducting intelligence operations. I adjusted the microphone in front of me and glanced briefly at the gallery. My father sat in the second row, his expression carefully neutral. Beside him, Lieutenant Colonel Chen wore his dress blue uniform with the same precision I remembered from our first meeting 6 months ago. In the back, I recognized several soldiers from units I'd served with over the years, men and women who'd taken leave to attend this hearing. Senator, could you be more specific about which operations or protocols you're referring to? Senator Michael Torres of Texas leaned forward, his voice carrying the practiced skepticism of a former prosecutor. Let's start with Syria. Major Blake, according to classified reports provided to this committee, you conducted 17 unauthorized reconnaissance missions over a 14-month deployment. Is that accurate? Sir, if by unauthorized you mean missions that weren't pre-approved by higher headquarters, then yes, that number is correct. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Senator Torres frowned. Major Blake, military effectiveness depends on chain of command and coordinated planning. How do you justify repeatedly operating outside your assigned parameters? I'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this question with Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the JAG officer assigned to help me navigate the confirmation process. We'd rehearsed dozens of scenarios, but sitting here now, I realized that prepared answers weren't going to be sufficient. Senator Torres, may I ask you a hypothetical question? I'm not sure that's appropriate. You have actionable intelligence that a group of American soldiers will be ambushed in 6 hours. Standard protocol requires you to submit your intelligence through channels, wait for verification, and then await orders from higher headquarters. That process takes 8 to 12 hours on average. Torres's expression suggested he saw where this was heading. Continue. Do you save the soldiers by acting on unverified intelligence? Or do you follow protocol and hope the process works fast enough to prevent American casualties? Major Blake, military protocol exists. Senator, with respect, protocol exists to coordinate large-scale operations and prevent friendly fire incidents. It doesn't exist to let good soldiers die while bureaucrats verify information that doesn't need verification. Senator Hawkins intervened before Torres could respond. Major Blake, this committee understands the practical challenges of combat operations. What concerns us is a pattern of independent decision-making that could undermine military effectiveness if adopted more broadly. I glanced at my father again. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture suggested he was paying closer attention than his neutral face indicated. Senator Hawkins, if I may, I'd like to address that concern directly. Every unauthorized mission I conducted was based on intelligence that previous experience had taught me was reliable. Kurdish militia reports about ISIS movement patterns. Local tribal leaders warning about IED placements. Syrian Democratic Forces intelligence about safe passage routes. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared independently of my JAG counsel. I'd like to submit documentation showing the results of those 17 missions. 43 American lives saved through early warning of ambushes, 12 successful equipment recoveries that prevented sensitive technology from reaching enemy hands, 6 high-value target captures that provided strategic intelligence for subsequent operations. Senator David Walsh of Montana, a veteran himself, looked up from his notes. Major Blake, those results are impressive. But how do we know you weren't just lucky? How do we know that other officers using your methods wouldn't create more problems than they solve? It was a fair question, and one I'd been grappling with since accepting this nomination. Senator Walsh, that's exactly why I've spent the last 6 months developing standardized training protocols for intelligence officers working with local militia units. I gestured toward a second folder. These materials include assessment criteria for evaluating local intelligence sources, decision-making frameworks for time-sensitive operations, and communication protocols that keep higher headquarters informed without compromising mission effectiveness. Senator Ellen Rodriguez of California shuffled through her own documents. Major Blake, I'm looking at efficiency reports from your previous commanding officers. Lieutenant Colonel Davis describes your methods as operationally effective but potentially dangerous if replicated by less experienced officers. General Thompson calls your approach brilliant in execution, but problematic for large-scale implementation. How do you respond to these concerns? I'd expected this line of questioning, but hearing those specific quotes read aloud in a public forum still stung. Both officers had been supportive of my work in private conversations, but military efficiency reports required diplomatic language that could be interpreted multiple ways. Senator Rodriguez, I think those assessments reflect a challenge of transitioning from individual operational success to systematic institutional change. What worked for me as a single intelligence officer operating with specific local partners needs to be adapted for broader military use. Senator Hawkins consulted her tablet. Major Blake, let's discuss the position you're being nominated for. Command of the 75th Rangers Intelligence Detachment would give you authority over intelligence operations for one of the Army's most elite units. It would also put you in situations where your preference for independent action could have strategic implications. Are you prepared for that level of responsibility? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Everything I'd worked toward over 8 years of military service had led to this moment. The opportunity to implement my methods at a level where they could actually change how the Army conducted intelligence operations in hostile environments. But it also meant taking responsibility for the actions of other officers who might not have my experience with local militia integration or my instincts for reading battlefield situations. Senator Hawkins, I believe the position requires exactly the kind of adaptability that my experience has taught me. The 75th Rangers operate in environments where standard intelligence protocols are often insufficient. They need intelligence officers who can build trust with local partners, make time-sensitive decisions based on incomplete information, and prioritize mission success over bureaucratic compliance. Senator Torres looked skeptical. Major Blake, what happens when one of your subordinates makes a decision based on your methods and gets American soldiers killed? The question hit like a physical blow. It was the nightmare scenario that every military leader faced, the possibility that your training or guidance could lead to tragic consequences. Senator, that's a risk that every commanding officer accepts when they take responsibility for other people's lives. My job isn't to eliminate risk, it's to prepare my officers to make good decisions when perfect information isn't available and time is running out. I paused, thinking about Staff Sergeant Santos and the dignity with which she'd honored fallen soldiers. But if I'm not willing to accept that responsibility, then I'm not worthy of commanding soldiers who accept that risk every day. Senator Walsh nodded slowly. Major Blake, assuming this committee confirms your nomination, what would be your priorities in your first year of command? I'd been thinking about this question for months, but sitting here now I realized my answer had evolved beyond the prepared talking points I'd discussed with Colonel Mitchell. Senator Walsh, My first priority would be developing a comprehensive training program that teaches intelligence officers how to operate effectively in austere environments. Not just technical skills, but cultural competency, local partnership development, and decision-making under extreme time pressure. I looked directly at Senator Hawkins. My second priority would be establishing performance metrics that prioritize mission effectiveness over protocol compliance. We need to reward intelligence officers who save American lives, not just those who follow proper procedures. Senator Rodriguez leaned forward. And your third priority? Building trust with the Rangers themselves. Special operations forces need to know that their intelligence officers understand their missions and share their risks. That means intelligence officers who are willing to leave the safety of command posts and work alongside the soldiers whose lives depend on the information they provide. The hearing room fell quiet. Several senators exchanged glances, and I could hear the soft scratching of pens on paper as gallery observers took notes. Senator Hawkins consulted her watch. Major Blake, this committee will recess for deliberation. We'll reconvene in 1 hour for final questions and voting. As the senators filed out, I remained seated at the witness table, reviewing my notes and trying to assess how the questioning had gone. The gallery behind me buzzed with conversation, but I couldn't make out individual words. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. Lieutenant Colonel Chen stood behind me, his expression serious but not unfriendly. Major Blake, regardless of what this committee decides, I want you to know something. The soldiers who served under you in Syria have been following this hearing. They asked me to give you this. He handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was a simple message written in black ink. We trust you with our lives. That's the only confirmation that matters. Below the message were 17 signatures, every soldier from the units I'd worked with during my deployment. I looked up at Chen, suddenly understanding why he'd attended this hearing. Thank you, sir. Major Blake, he said quietly. Your father is proud of you. He may not know how to say it, but he is. I glanced toward the gallery where my father was still seated, reviewing documents on his tablet. For the first time since entering this hearing room, I felt ready for whatever decision the committee would make. The vote was 14-12 in favor of confirmation, but the narrow margin told only part of the story. What the public record wouldn't show was the 2-hour closed-door session that had preceded the final vote, where classified details of my operations had been discussed in executive session. Senator Hawkins had called me back into the hearing room, alone without counsel, for what she termed clarification on sensitive matters. The gallery had been cleared, the transcript sealed, and only the committee members remained to hear about missions that would never appear in official records. Major Blake, she'd said, her voice carrying a gravity that hadn't been present during the public hearing, we need to discuss Operation Nightfall. My stomach had tightened. Nightfall was the classified operation that had earned me the Distinguished Service Cross and nearly gotten me court-martialed. It was also the mission that had fundamentally changed how Special Operations Command approached intelligence gathering in denied territories. Senator, I'm not sure how much detail I can provide in this setting. Major, this committee has been fully briefed on Nightfall by the Secretary of Defense. We know what you did. What we need to understand is why you did it. The operation had taken place 14 months ago in northeastern Afghanistan, near the Pakistani border. Intelligence had indicated that a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against NATO supply convoys, was meeting with Pakistani ASI officers in a compound that technically sat in a gray area between the two countries. Standard protocol would have required diplomatic coordination with Pakistan, intelligence sharing with multiple agencies, and approval from the National Security Council before any action could be taken. The estimated timeline for that approval process was 6 to 8 weeks. The intelligence indicating the meeting had a shelf life of 72 hours. Senator Hawkins, the target, had been responsible for 47 coalition casualties over the previous 6 months. Pakistani intelligence services had been protecting him for over a year, moving him across the border whenever U.S. forces got close. This meeting represented the first opportunity to capture or eliminate him in operational memory. Major Blake, You crossed an international border without authorization and conducted a solo reconnaissance mission in a compound that was technically on Pakistani soil. Do you understand the diplomatic implications of that action? I understood them perfectly. I'd also understood that 47 families had lost sons, daughters, husbands, and wives because political considerations had prevented military action against a known threat. Senator, I understood that if I didn't act on that intelligence, the target would disappear for another 6 months and continue killing American soldiers while diplomats negotiated about whether we were allowed to stop him. Senator Torres had interrupted. Major Blake, what if you'd been captured? What if Pakistan had decided to treat your presence as an act of war? Then I would have faced the consequences of my decision. But the families of those 47 casualties wouldn't have to face the consequences of our inaction. The room had fallen silent. Several senators had exchanged looks that suggested this conversation was moving beyond simple confirmation proceedings. Major Blake, Senator Walsh had said carefully, walk us through what actually happened during nightfall. I'd spent 47 hours conducting surveillance on the compound, documenting the movements of both Taliban and Pakistani ISI personnel. The intelligence I'd gathered had revealed not just the location of the high-value target, but also evidence of broader cooperation between Pakistani intelligence services and Taliban leadership. More importantly, I'd identified a pattern of meetings that occurred every 6 weeks, always in the same location, always with the same security arrangements. That pattern had enabled Special Operations Command to plan a capture operation that had been executed 3 weeks later, officially authorized through proper diplomatic channels, that had netted not just the original target, but 3 additional high-value individuals. The diplomatic fallout from nightfall was manageable, Senator Rodriguez had observed, because you provided actionable intelligence that led to a successful authorized operation. But what if your surveillance had been detected? What if the diplomatic consequences had been severe? Senator, every military operation involves risk assessment. The risk of diplomatic complications had to be weighed against the certainty of continued American casualties if no action was taken. Senator Hawkins had leaned forward. Major Blake, here's what concerns this committee. Your methods work when executed by someone with your specific experience and judgment. But what happens when other officers try to replicate your approach without your instincts or cultural knowledge? It was the fundamental question that had haunted my entire career. My success in unconventional operations stemmed from years of building relationships with local partners, learning cultural nuances that couldn't be taught in a classroom, and developing an intuitive understanding of when rules could be bent and when they absolutely couldn't be broken. Senator, that's exactly why the position I'm being nominated for is critical. The 75th Rangers Intelligence Detachment needs officers who can operate effectively in gray areas where standard protocols are insufficient. But they also need systematic training that teaches other officers how to make those same kinds of decisions. Explain that. Senator Hawkins, my experience has taught me that effective unconventional operations depend on 3 factors: cultural competency, local partnership development, and decision-making frameworks that prioritize mission success while minimizing political risk. Those are skills that can be taught, but only by instructors who've actually applied them in operational environments. Senator Torres had consulted his notes. Major Blake, assuming this committee confirms your nomination, how would you prevent future officers from taking the kind of unauthorized actions that characterized your own career? Sir, I wouldn't prevent them. I'd teach them how to do it right. The answer had clearly surprised several committee members. Senator, unauthorized doesn't mean unplanned or reckless. Every operation I conducted outside standard protocols was carefully planned, thoroughly assessed for risk, and executed with backup plans that minimized potential consequences. The difference between my approach and standard military planning wasn't the level of preparation. It was the willingness to accept personal responsibility for decisions that bureaucratic structures couldn't make fast enough. Senator Walsh nodded slowly. Major Blake, what you're describing sounds like a fundamental shift in how the military approaches decision-making in special operations contexts. Senator, special operations forces already operate under different rules than conventional units. They have to, because conventional rules aren't designed for the environments where they work. What I'm proposing is systematic training that teaches intelligence officers how to operate effectively within that framework. The closed session had continued for another hour, covering classified operations in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan that had never been publicly discussed. By the end, I'd revealed more about my operational methods than I'd ever documented in official reports. When the committee had finally reconvened for the public vote, the questions had been perfunctory. The real deliberation had happened behind closed doors, and the narrow margin of confirmation had reflected genuine disagreement about whether the military was ready for the kind of systematic change I represented. The phone call came at 0347 hours, 3 weeks after my confirmation as lieutenant colonel and 2 days after I'd officially assumed command of the 75th Rangers Intelligence Detachment. The secure line crackled with static from a satellite connection routed through multiple encryption layers. Colonel Blake, this is Major Thompson, 2nd Battalion 75th Rangers. We have an urgent intelligence requirement in Syria. I sat up in my quarters at Fort Benning, immediately alert. Thompson's unit was conducting counter-terrorism operations near the Turkish border, hunting ISIS cells that had been targeting Kurdish civilian populations. Go ahead, Major. Ma'am, we have actionable intelligence on a high-value target, but the intelligence comes from a local source that higher headquarters doesn't consider reliable. Target is meeting with key lieutenants tomorrow night, but the meeting location is in a contested area that would require cross-coordination with multiple coalition forces. I recognized the scenario immediately. Local intelligence that couldn't be verified through official channels. Time-sensitive targeting opportunity that would be lost if subjected to standard approval processes. The exact situation that had defined my entire career. Major Thompson, what's your assessment of the source reliability? Colonel, my team has worked with this source for 4 months. His intelligence has been accurate on 6 previous operations, including 2 that resulted in successful high-value target captures. But he's not in our official database because he's technically a civilian contractor working for Syrian Democratic Forces. I walked to my office window, looking out at the pre-dawn darkness. In 6 hours, I'd be conducting my first intelligence briefing as a commander, presenting assessment methods to a room full of officers who would be watching to see whether my unconventional approach could be systematized and taught. Major, what does higher headquarters want you to do? They want us to submit the intelligence through coalition intelligence, sharing protocols, and wait for verification. The estimated timeline is 4 to 6 days. And what do you think we should do? There was a pause. Thompson was testing me, trying to determine whether my reputation for unauthorized operations would translate into official command guidance that bent the rules. Colonel, respectfully, I think we should move on the target tonight. But I need cover from higher headquarters if this goes sideways. Cover? That was what had been missing from my own career. Senior officers willing to take responsibility for unconventional operations that achieved mission success at the cost of bureaucratic compliance. Major Thompson. Stand by for new guidance. I hung up and immediately placed a call to General Patricia Morrison, my direct superior at Special Operations Command. Morrison had been one of the officers who'd supported my confirmation, but this would be the first test of whether that support extended to operational decision-making. General Morrison, this is Lieutenant Colonel Blake. I have a time-sensitive intelligence situation that requires command guidance. I briefed her on Thompson's situation, outlining the intelligence source, the targeting opportunity, and the timeline constraints that made standard approval processes impractical. Rebecca, she said, using my first name in a way that suggested this conversation was moving beyond formal military communication. What's your recommendation? General, I recommend authorizing immediate action based on locally verified intelligence, with full documentation and post-operation reporting to satisfy coalition intelligence sharing requirements. You're asking me to authorize exactly the kind of operation that your entire career has been built on. Yes, ma'am. But with one critical difference. This time, it's being conducted under official command authority with systematic risk assessment and coordinated backup planning. General Morrison was quiet for nearly a minute. When she spoke again, Her voice carried the weight of a decision that would influence how Special Operations Command approached unconventional intelligence operations. Lieutenant Colonel Blake, you have authorization to proceed, but I want real-time reporting and immediate notification if the situation changes. Understood, General. I called Thompson back and provided the authorization he needed. Then I spent the next 18 hours monitoring the operation through secure communications, providing tactical guidance and coordinating with multiple units to ensure backup support was available if needed. The operation was flawlessly executed. Thompson's team successfully captured the high-value target and 2 key lieutenants, gathering intelligence that led to the disruption of 3 additional ISIS cells over the following week. More importantly, the operation had been conducted under official command authority, with systematic documentation and coordinated support that demonstrated how unconventional intelligence methods could be integrated into standard military operations. When I briefed General Morrison on the results, she made an observation that would reshape my understanding of my role as a commander. Rebecca, what you accomplished last night wasn't just successful mission execution. You proved that systematic unconventional operations can achieve better results than individual unauthorized actions. She was right. By providing official cover and coordinated support for Thompson's operation, we'd achieved the same mission success that I'd accomplished through unauthorized actions, but without the career risk and political complications that had characterized my previous operations. General, I think this approach could be replicated across Special Operations Command, local intelligence sources, time-sensitive targeting, and command authority that prioritizes mission success over bureaucratic compliance. Draft a proposal, she said. I want systematic implementation guidelines that other commanders can use. The promotion ceremony took place on a crisp October morning at Fort Bragg, with the 82nd Airborne Division's parade field providing a backdrop of autumn colors and military precision. 18 months had passed since my confirmation as lieutenant colonel, and the promotion to full colonel represented not just personal advancement, but institutional validation of the unconventional intelligence methods I'd spent 10 years developing. My father stood in the front row of the reviewing stand, wearing his dress blue uniform with the 4 stars of a full general. Beside him, General Morrison wore the expression of an officer who'd watched systematic change transform how the Army conducted special operations, intelligence gathering. The presiding officer was General David Kim, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, whose presence indicated that this ceremony carried significance beyond routine military promotion. Colonel Rebecca Blake, General Kim announced, his voice carrying across the parade field, has distinguished herself through exceptional leadership in developing and implementing unconventional intelligence methodologies that have fundamentally improved special operations effectiveness. The citation continued with language that would have been unthinkable when I'd first enlisted as a private 12 years ago. Terms like innovative operational approaches and systematic integration of local partnership protocols described methods that had once been considered borderline insubordination. As General Kim pinned the silver eagles of a full colonel to my uniform, I thought about the journey that had led to this moment. The young woman who'd dropped out of Georgetown to prove herself worthy of wearing the uniform had evolved into an officer whose methods were being adopted across multiple commands. The 75th Rangers Intelligence Detachment had become a model for other special operations units. The training protocols I'd developed were being implemented at the Army Intelligence Center. Most significantly, the systematic approach to unconventional operations had reduced both casualties and mission failures across multiple theaters of operation. After the ceremony, my father approached me with an expression I'd rarely seen. Unqualified pride mixed with something that might have been awe. Rebecca, he said, using my rank for the first time in our personal conversation, Colonel Blake, I owe you an apology. I looked at him carefully. We'd rebuilt our relationship gradually over the past 2 years, but he'd never explicitly acknowledged the years of disapproval and dismissal that had characterized our interactions. Dad, that's not necessary. Yes, it is. He glanced around the reception area where fellow officers were congratulating other promotion recipients, I spent 30 years thinking that military leadership meant minimizing risk and following established protocol. You've proven that real leadership sometimes means taking calculated risks to achieve results that conventional methods can't accomplish. He paused, seeming to search for words that carried appropriate weight. When you enlisted, I thought you were throwing your life away. When you volunteered for dangerous assignments, I thought you were being reckless. When you operated outside standard protocols, I thought you were jeopardizing your career. I waited, sensing that he needed to finish this thought completely. What I failed to understand was that you were developing capabilities that the military desperately needed, but didn't know how to systematize. You weren't being reckless. You were being innovative in areas where innovation was essential. General Morrison joined our conversation, carrying 2 glasses of champagne and wearing the satisfied expression of a senior officer whose strategic gamble had paid off spectacularly. "General Blake," she said to my father, "I hope you're proud of your daughter. The intelligence methodologies she's developed have been adopted by NATO's Special Operations Forces. We're training officers from 12 different countries using her protocols." My father nodded, but his attention remained focused on me. "Rebecca, what's next for you?" I'd been expecting this question, and my answer reflected both personal ambition and institutional responsibility. "Dad, I'm being considered for assignment to the National Defense University as Director of Unconventional Operations Studies. It would mean developing a comprehensive curriculum that teaches military officers how to operate effectively in environments where standard protocols are insufficient. The position would represent the ultimate integration of my operational experience with systematic military education. Instead of training individual officers through hands-on deployment experience, I'd be developing academic programs that could prepare hundreds of officers for unconventional operations. "That sounds like exactly the kind of position you should be in," my father said. "Teaching other officers how to achieve mission success while managing political and strategic risks." General Morrison raised her glass. "To Colonel Blake, who proved that the best way to change an institution is to excel within it until the institution adapts to your methods." As I raised my own glass, I looked around the reception area at the officers who'd attended this ceremony. Many of them were students I'd trained, subordinates I'd commanded, and colleagues who'd implemented variations of the methods I'd developed. Lieutenant Colonel Chen approached our group, now wearing the silver leaves of his promotion and carrying himself with the confidence of an officer whose career had been shaped by exposure to unconventional thinking. "Colonel Blake," he said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you personally. The training protocols you developed have been implemented across my brigade. We've had 0 mission failures and minimal casualties over the past year." Chain's success represented something more significant than individual achievement. He'd taken methods that I'd developed through trial and error in combat zones and applied them systematically across an entire brigade. His results proved that unconventional intelligence operations could be scaled up and institutionalized without losing their effectiveness. "Chen, your success validates everything we've been working toward. You've proven that these methods work when applied by officers who understand the principles behind them." My father listened to this exchange with an expression that suggested he was finally understanding the broader implications of my career choices. I hadn't just been a successful individual operator, I'd been developing systematic approaches that could transform how the military conducted operations in complex environments. As the reception continued, I found myself reflecting on the conversation that had started this entire journey. Staff Sergeant Santos, teaching me about service and sacrifice in that Pentagon office 12 years ago, Drill Sergeant Williams, showing me that leadership meant choosing people over performance metrics. The soldiers who'd trusted me with their lives in dozens of operations across multiple theaters. Each of them had contributed to my understanding of what military service actually meant, not the abstract strategic thinking that my father had initially emphasized, but the concrete responsibility of keeping good people alive while accomplishing missions that protected American interests. The young woman who'd enlisted to prove herself worthy of the uniform had evolved into an officer whose methods were reshaping how the military approached its most challenging operations. But more importantly, She'd learned that true leadership meant creating systems that enabled other people to succeed rather than simply demonstrating individual competence. As the ceremony concluded and guests began to depart, my father approached me one final time. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "I have something for you." He handed me a small box containing a single military decoration, his own Distinguished Service Medal, awarded for strategic leadership during Operation Desert Storm. This represents 25 years of trying to serve my country through strategic planning and institutional leadership. I want you to have it, because you've accomplished something I never could. I looked at the medal, understanding its significance not just as a military decoration, but as a symbol of his recognition that my approach to service had achieved results that his own methods couldn't have accomplished. "Dad, what do you mean? You've proven that individual courage and systematic institutional change aren't contradictory. You've shown that the best way to serve your country is to excel at the mission, while simultaneously improving how the mission gets accomplished." He paused, looking directly into my eyes with an expression that conveyed both respect and genuine affection. "You've become exactly the kind of officer I always hoped you'd be, even when I was too stubborn to recognize what that looked like." As I drove away from Fort Bragg that evening, I realized that the journey from disappointed daughter to respected colleague had required not just proving my competence, but transforming my father's understanding of what competence actually meant in contemporary military service. The woman who'd once been told she'd never amount to anything had become an officer whose methods were reshaping how America's military conducted its most critical operations. But more importantly, she'd learned that true success meant creating systems that enabled other people to achieve the same level of excellence. The young private who'd enlisted to prove herself worthy of the uniform had evolved into a colonel whose legacy would be measured not by her individual achievements, but by the officers she'd trained and the lives she'd helped save through systematic improvement of military effectiveness. And for the first time in her adult life, she had her father's unqualified respect, not because she'd finally conformed to his expectations, but because she'd exceeded them in ways he'd never imagined possible. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.